Шановні колеги, друзі,
Dear colleagues and friends, good afternoon. Thank you for finding time and joining this our event. My name is Maria Tomak. Mm, I am a representative of the mission of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and today we are launching the event jointly with the National Art Museum of Ukraine on the occasion of the Day of Remembrance of the victims of the Crimean Tatar genocide. And today we will discuss the decolonization. And co-organizer of this event is also Crimea organization. Our event today is called Cultural Perception of Crimea, the decolonization aspect. I believe that the topic how to overcome colonization, how to decolonize the Crimea is an important topic, and we would like to discuss it by the prism of arts, fine arts. Perhaps I need to explain why the mission of the President of Ukraine had become a co-organizer of this event, because we believe that the colonization should become the aspect of policy making, so there is no contradiction between our mission and this event. Today we have representatives from the diplomatic corps, from international institutions, and at the beginning I would like to make several technical remarks. That yeah, this event is held in the course of events on the occasion of the Day of Remembrance of the victims of Crimean Tatar genocide, the deportation of Crimean Tatars, etc. And I'm very grateful to Mavelia Halil, who was one of those who inspired this event. So, in continuation of today's event, tomorrow at noon, the stream of this event will be available from our media resources. And before giving the floor to our presenters today, I would like to present Maria Halil, journalist, psychologist, program manager of the Crimean Tatars website, um, and also the author of the special podcast devoted to Crimea and Crimean topics. And I'm happy to give the floor to the director of the National Museum, National Art Museum of Ukraine, to Ms. Julia Litvinets. I'm happy that today we have a very brief one-day exhibition of artists devoted to Crimea. Before the full-scale invasion, we had just introduced the audio guides in our museum in Crimean Tatar language, and we had big hopes as to the broad use of those audio guides, but the full-scale invasion started, and actually today's event is a continuation of that work. For us, it is extremely important to host this event because speaking about arts, we come to the story about very difficult events, tough events, because working with pictures and art objects, we approach to the things which had remained from that tragic times, these artifacts we witnessed that time. And I'm happy to welcome you in our museum. Thank you very much to the mission of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. We are very happy to see you all here. Thank you, Maria. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Milatasha, permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Thank you, Maria. Mm, it, it's a big pleasure to say welcome words in this room with unfortunately bare walls that were beautifully decorated with pictures in the past. The full-scale war had changed the background and the context of our everyday lives. I would like to recollect a story from the 3 years point when we, together with Mr. Aliyev and Sevgil Musaeva, started the initiative to cover the events in Crimea several times a week. Recently, Rustam Saleev, a ceramic artist, approached to Crimea South and suggested to quit the Crimea and together with his rich collection of Crimean Tatar artifacts, ceramics, etc. And he explained that he expected that the Russian Federation would expropriate all the Ukrainian art objects, including Crimean Tatar national objects, and we can be quite sure of that because this story started back in 1783 when the Russian Empire for the first time annexed the Crimea, and immediately after that historic moment in 18th century they started to extinguish all the Crimean Tatar history and culture and heritage, and further on, not only the Russian Empire but the Soviet Union, the Soviet Russia tried not to notice the Crimean Tatars and their culture, and thus that fact that attempt not to notice found its reflection in arts, and you can clearly notice that there are a lot of landscapes, beautiful landscapes of Crimea. And some of them you may notice Crimean Tatars as indigenous people, and that's why we supported and warmly greeted the idea of the museums to exhibit the art objects from the Crimean Tatar heritage and related to the Crimean Tatar history and the history of Crimea in general in public space on the eve of the anniversary of the Crimean Tatar People's genocide. And I'm very happy to wish you efficient discussion, and we're happy that Crimea South and the representative, the office, the mission of the president can join this discussion. Thank you, Tamila. Having seen the topic of this event, I immediately started to think, what if? What if the libraries in Crimea, the old Crimean Tatar libraries, were not burnt in the Bakhchisarai Palace? If lots of art objects were not destroyed? What if the generations, the past generations, would learn lessons from the mistakes done by the previous generations? What if the sequence of generations would not be disrupted? In this case, we might expect that uh, generation by generation of Crimean Tatars would work and reflect this world in their native language, in their own way, and in this case, the world might be much richer. Today, with our guests, we are dis- have discussion, including Ms. Oksana Barshinova, Deputy Director General of the National Arts Museum of Ukraine, Ms. Olesya Ostrovska-Luda, Director General of the Arts Arsenal, Mr. Alexei Mustafin, Ukrainian journalist, researcher, and politician. Mm. And Mr. Martin Alexander Kisler, historian, researcher, and lecturer at the National University of the Kiev Mohyla Academy, and um, also Mobile Halil, journalist, psychologist, and program director of the site Crimean Tatars. Thank you for this introduction. Perhaps our introductory and welcoming part had become too extended, but nevertheless, before giving the floor to Ms. Oksana, I would like to quote famous singer Jamala um, in her uh, soundtrack Kirim, she mentioned the following. I would like that each Ukrainian would look at himself as a part of Crimea, bring Crimea back to Ukraine mentally. Um, uh, I would like to bring Crimea back, not for the not as a resort space, but as a part of your history. All these marvelous sea and beach landscapes, these old streets and villages reflect the reality without that peoples from whom all those beautiful landscapes were deprived. And here you can see obviously the exotization, and it is a shame because this is a reflection of the cultural looting. And one more quotation from Maria Shenkarenko. Ukrainian state has wrongly interpreted the national and ethnical situation in Crimea, having blamed Crimean Tatars and putting them responsibility for the political and ethnical instability. Ukrainians gladly attend Musafir Crimean Tatar restaurant, but do not think further about the aspects related to decolonization of the Crimean Peninsula. I think that several quotations bring us into the context of our today's topic and encourage us to reflect further. Dear colleagues, I would encourage you to speak loudly and strictly into the mic to allow proper translation. It's my pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Oksana Barshinova, Deputy Director of the National Art Museum of Ukraine. Oksana, it seems to me that the exhibited pictures reflect that glassy approach to the vision of Crimea and its culture, working with the topic of Crimea, Crimean Tatar culture. What challenges do you face in this aspect, and especially in relation to the arts and different epochs in the arts, how they are represented in the arts? Thank you, Maria. I agree with Yulia Litvinets that we are very happy to welcome you all in our museum. For us, this is an outstanding event. I would like to start with several words, a couple of words about this exhibition. It covers the pictures beginning with the 19th century painters and up to the work of artists from 1986. This is actually this actually covers the history of reflection of Crimean Tatar presence in Crimea, beginning with the works of Ivan Ivazovsky and other outstanding artists like Svetlitsky and others. Speaking about 19th century, you may notice some degree of exoticization, representation of Crimea as an exotic place which represents people in exotic costumes, exotic landscapes, and exotic traditions. While pictures of the 20th century is represented by the works of Vasil Khrushchevsky, who quite often visited Crimea and quite realistically reflected the Crimean Tatar culture, grasped the specificity of Crimean Tatar landscapes, and in his works you definitely can feel his respect to the Crimean Tatar heritage in Crimea. As for Sorotenko, it shows the emptiness of this space, and I agree with Tamila that this introduces tragedy of post-war Crimean peninsula. Mykola Gloshenko and the next work, especially Mykola Gloshenko, shows this empty landscape without people, and you feel this emptiness and old buildings, but without humans, without people, and the picture of contemporary artist, which is very important for today's context. It was painted in times when Crimean Tatars started to come back to their native lands, and it reflects the changes which began in late 1980s, and it contrasts with the rest of pictures exhibited here. Looking at these pictures from 19th and 20th centuries, uh, uh, you may feel the richness of our collection. Unfortunately, we do not have Crimean Tatar painters in our collection. But in late 19th, early 20th century, they had the whole generation of such artists. I'm thinking about Vasilkivsky and his graphic works. You can see them on our screen, and which are under research. They provide very detailed reflection and depiction of everyday life, of surrounding and the economy of Crimean Tatars. This painter was deeply involved into everyday life of Crimean Tatars. In general speaking, about challenges before the museum workers, we have to mention that the museum collection in general remains under researched from the Crimean Tatar culture point of view. You mentioned the recording of audio guides in Crimean Tatar language, but this was just the first step towards development of this Crimean Tatar topic. We believe that our collection suggests and provides rich material for further research. And we feel that we have to include the Crimean topic into our permanent exposition. Looking at Vasil Krichevsky work Twilight at the Crimean vineyards. This is very rich picture from the interpretation point of view, and it requires some context to be supplemented to it. We believe that the history of Ukrainian art should be presented in more comprehensive and in more complicated way, a bit more complex that we got accustomed to see it. In our exposition, Modernism in Ukraine, you see the explications left on the walls. We try to introduce this approach to look a bit more comprehensively at the cultural and artistic processes. Immediately upon our victory, we would like to launch special projects devoted to the Crimean Tatars topic and to strengthen this Crimean Tatar narrative. And of course, start to include the Crimean Tatar vision approach into broader projects. Back in 2019, together with Galina Sklarenka, we had a project about Ukrainian Baroque style, and part of that artifacts showed Ukrainian synagogues of the period of Ukrainian Baroque epoch. And Smirshik contemporary Crimean Tatar artist, was a part of that project, who presented the optic of Crimean Tatar people in that very project, which it reached. It is largely, and this only suggests that we have a lot of work ahead of us, and um, we are eager to start this work as soon as possible.
Okay, yeah, I want to continue on our conversation about the paintings, and I want to ask Maria. Much has been said in the society about the Crimea with the taste of baklava. What do you see here and what you don't see here? Well, it's hard for me to talk about the art. I'm not an expert on art. I'm only a typical spectator. I think this is a beautiful Crimea, but it's not realistic Crimea, because we all know that Crimea is about sea and mountains, but we need to look at the Crimea differently, have a different view on it, because it's important to understand the context in which those creators of these artworks were. What time they lived in, and what they saw when they actually went to the Crimea, when they stayed in the Crimea. I look at the art from the prism of psychology, and that's a very good experience, because creativity is always about sublimed experience or trauma. And when we see a picture, we should not only be looking at what we see directly, but also what the creator wanted to tell us. And when we visit different museums and we see different pictures, we look at the colors, details and style, but we should also be able to hear this message that the creator wanted to convey. I didn't have a chance to look at those pictures closely enough, but indeed they sort of depict this beautiful Crimea, but the Crimea is not alive on these pictures, and it's important to see that, because when we read about the Crimea, when we look at different artworks related to Crimea, we need to understand what the author wanted to show us, what life they wanted to show us. And these pictures, at first glance, they deliver this message of people-less Crimea. What does it mean? I mean, what kind of Crimea they saw? Why do we see that kind of message from the from the authors, from the creators? We need to think about that when I have a chance to look at them closely. Yes, indeed, I had also the same parallel view, similar view. When we had Holodomor in Ukraine, when people died in millions, and at the same time the Stalinist regime would be talking about the fact that people are now living better and more wealthy and so on. So yeah, that's about it. When I look at the pictures that date back to that time, so this is this diversity that I also bear in mind. When Oksana talks about decolonization of Crimea, I mean, I remember in the arsenal in Kiev, there was a project about impressive stories of the Crimea. So what is it all about? What we mean when we say decolonization, and for you as a head of one of the most important institutions in the country, in this area, how important is decolonization topic for you? Because I think you were thinking about that before the 24th of February, when the whole world recognized the fact, but the project did occur before, and share with us your opinion, and tell us what the Crimea has a special context compared to the Ukrainian mainland. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, I want to jumpstart from what you have just said. When we look at the those landscape pictures, this is sort of generalization, a summary of the author's view, and they those pictures tend to generalize those surface characteristics, of the Crimea. Just like Oksana says, what we see on the pictures of Carpathians of the 1950s, 60s, we know that there was armed resistance to the Soviet, but at the same time those pictures depict the landscape and or the creativity of local population. What I mean is, art is about a method used in many places, but it was more radical in the Crimea. And the consequences were really tragic. And as Oksana says, as Oksana was saying, I remembered another artist a couple of decades before. And those pictures really showed people. You could see that there were apparently locals like Crimean Tatars, and I remember I saw them and I just remembered them immediately right now. It was also some kind of generalization back then, but with people. You asked me about the Ukrainian political attitude, whether the Ukraine wasn't caring much about Ukraine. Well, I think to some extent indeed, but it was only because of the fear of this huge political problem that could have happened, because in the 90s it was really politically difficult in the Crimea, and Ukraine kind of distanced itself a little bit from that. But the same can be said about Donbass or Transcarpathian region. So I think that is just the characteristics of the Ukrainian governance at that time, and there are several elements to that. I don't think it was a kind of choice, but it was an attitude to follow the inertia, to do just like it has always been done before during the 70s, 80s and then 90s. So the idea was to support the same collectives, local collectives using the same approaches and methods. This was a kind of inertia that led to 2014, to the events in 2014. Second approach, that was the resistance to aggressive Soviet policies. You remember that the Soviet policies were very aggressive. I remember this festival of youth and students during the Soviet times. It was a really big thing in Moscow during the Soviet times for the youth and students. It was very aggressive, and it was a very aggressive way to indoctrinate the people. And some people who were responsible for the policies in the 90s, they wanted to get rid of this heritage, and sometimes it wasn't possible. And the third thing that I want to share with you, these are only my personal views, they're not based on some researchers. So the third thing is the use of a Soviet method of cultural policies to affirm Ukrainian culture, and it was also done in a really generalized kind of Soviet style, Soviet way. And when you have several of those types of attitudes, there is always some place for some unorganized policy that really is focused on achieving some common good. but we didn't have the consensus of the civil society about what Ukraine means as a country, as a society, and now we have maybe I'm an optimist, but we have now really a bigger consensus in terms of the civil identity, in terms of the freedom and liberty to express our opinions, different cultures and different things. But we didn't have it for many years. Everyone was acting in the way he or she wanted to. And then at the end, the other issue. I think we need to have some policy making on the government level when you have some political vision, because we want to achieve the common good through election, democratic processes, but on the level of each institution, that's where we need it. And the two striking examples indicate that. This is the exhibition about the stories of Crimea and the exhibition of Belarus art that shows the year after the independence of Belarus. When we were thinking about this Belarus exhibition, we also thought that, well, Ukrainian culture had a lot of support from Polish culture during the previous decades on the level of interpersonal context or institutional context, and we also, as a cultural community, have some commitments, in particular to Belarus art and Belarus institutions, and that was one of the reasons why we wanted to organize this exhibition, Belarus art. When we were thinking about the exhibition about the Crimea, we had 2 points. First, when we thought about that, when we discussed it with colleagues, we thought that, well, in Arsenal we wanted to implement the project that really resonates with reverberate with the sense of the time. And we were thinking what was there in the mind of Kiev citizens, and we thought that it was before the 5th anniversary of occupation of Crimea, and it was evident how what kind of fatigue people had from political declarations and political projects, or documentaries. So we thought we needed to deliver the story in another way, and we wanted to show that Crimea and it's being cut away from the mainland. It was a historic abnormality, because Crimea has always been closely related to the mainland, and the way Crimea had been developing, it was related to the way peoples were moving. I think that many people know better about that than myself. And when we were creating that exhibition, we couldn't bring some of the exhibits from the Crimea for obvious reasons, but we managed to find similar exhibits on the mainland, which kind of indicated this connection that had been there for many years. And we embarked on that to display this connection for thousands of years. The only thing that we realized was that we can't say all the things because of the first annexation, because we would need to ask a lot of questions to ourselves about cooperation within or interaction within Ukraine. So that's what we were going to do on the next stage. But to sum it up and to answer your question whether it can be regarded as a cultural policy on the level of institutions, I think we can, but we didn't think about that from the very beginning. It wasn't our framework of thinking. But when you look retrospectively, yes, you can say that indeed that was the case. I have a question to Martin Alexander as a historian. Tell us what was the correspondence between the politics and the art, and how the Crimea was depicted in art. Thank you for the question. Much has been said about that. Historically speaking, the first point from which we can count the political countdown is the following. The Crimea was announced during the times of colonialism, and the Russian Empire received its kind of small element to join this club of colonial nations. And the first step of colonial history of the Crimea, we know it very well. It was depicted by famous German and other artists, because the Russian Empire would invite people who had some experience. And this period of painting Crimea was really empathic for the local population. But it shows those exotic clothes and those people in those clothes, and that lasted until the Crimean War. And then the picture started to show not a mysterious Crimea, but something that can be owned, and that was a period when people started thinking about resources, and Crimea had this southern seaside area, and people, were thinking and talking about that resources of Crimea, the usefulness of the Crimean air and sea. And as a result, people from the big cities started to travel there, in particular the Tsar family. That was this distinctive part of this colonialism. What was going on with the population, with the indigenous population was squeezed out during those times. Gradually they became marginal everywhere, in politics, in culture too. The culture of the 19th century, the only thing you can see right now is those songs about this, the life or routine life of the people there, or the need to relocate. There was some sort of renaissance that led to creation of this these beautiful artworks, but there wasn't a big cultural renaissance. The colonization continued back then, and it was done very aggressively on the local level, on the level of local talents that were, rather taken to Moscow, to Russia, to go to schools there. For obvious reason, in 1937 everything ended. The year 1944, this was the peak of this history of attempts to colonize Crimea and the attempts to turn it into a Soviet project. The local population continued looking at the Crimea as a resource, just like during the Tsarist times. There was this idea that the Crimean South needs to be built as as layers as tiers. On the first level, this is a bathing level where people enjoy the sea. On the upper levels, the kind of administration and others. But during these times, not only the people were squeezed out, the whole names of cities were also deleted and replaced with Soviet names. I won't go to further because I don't have much time. Okay, we do have some time. So the period we're talking about starting from 1990s, we were trapped in this colonialism history. Our ideas during the independence were largely based on traditional views, and that's related to everything, related to those as chibureki, these national dishes, or other stereotypes. I can imagine how we can decolonialize history, but what can we do about art? I think it would be harder because we would need to retrieve the context or do something else. Because we can't fully decolonize art. This has been especially important since on 24th of February, these attempts to talk about decolonization, and that happens amid the context of people living there expecting to be mobilized, and that is reflected in art too. That's why probably we have so many pictures where there are no people, pictures about Crimea, like those trees and this swallow's nest, this famous monument, and in the Crimea. But much has been lost in terms of this, mystery of the Crimea. And I believe that the new history can be the foundation of these changes of this view on the Crimea for us. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit more about that. Firstly, when Martin was talking about this colonization policies of the Tsarist empire, and I remembered one of the books I read that depict the colonization of the land of Cherkess, land in Russia when those Russian colonists arrived there. One of the characters was a Ukrainian actually there, and they were happening the same things like you described. And the first thing that needs to be that we need to focus on, as Alisa says, those difficult questions that we need to ask ourselves, and what Martin talked about too. I mean the agency of the empire in the Crimea, because the Ukrainians were also agents of the Crimea. We didn't have the legal capacity, but certainly we have to accept it. Maybe it may look right now as not something relevant because Ukraine is being a victim of armed aggression, but now we are still thinking about the reintegration of the Crimea, and we need to think about that and realize these things, and we need that kind of conversation in the Ukrainian society. And I want to move on to our next speaker, Alexei Mustafin, who has recently published the book Pearls in the Steppe, conversation about the past of the Ukrainian South. And I think there's also a very important story here, because when I read this book, I saw a lot of important things that I didn't know. I mean, the things related to the Ukrainian history, and we understand that the story of Ukraine now, for all of us, is a story of Rus. Then there's Gallic and Volyn kingdoms, and but there is also a story of Ukrainian South that very often is left out. So I think that your book wants to change this. So can we really own someone's history? Is it a problem or not? And how does it make us richer? Because Olosya was talking about the globalism. We are also thinking about that. We were talking that Crimea is a part of global South, not of Russian Ruski Mir. What do you think about that? Well, the question is, well, can you own something or not? Well, if we believe that we are a political nation, the modern nations believe that they inherited the cultures of all the people that were living on their territories. Ukraine is not something unique here. Ukraine has combined all those traditions. And we had to division lines between steppe and non-steppe, and between sea and mainland, and it was organic. And much has always been said about the traditions of Rus times and or steppe traditions. Islam developed later after Christianity, but the conflict has never been there. It was an organic process of combination, and since we're talking about the post-colonization, when the Russia appeared on the south and north of Ukraine, it didn't stop this cooperation. And I want to support the previous speakers here because indeed those processes ran in parallel. Ukrainians were deprived a lot of their rights along with other peoples, and many people call it Oriental approach when Western big nations were colonizing other nations, and it happened the same way against Ukraine. So the approach was the same. It was an exotic country depicted in Gogol's books, and a mysterious country that was colonized. Then the end of this 19th century. Then there was this 19th century when people liked going and enjoying the seaside and fresh air. I remember that my grandma would tell me that many of her friends would go there to the Crimea, for example, on plein airs, to paint pictures, and that what was happening there in the 19th century. It was more assimilation processes that were going. But then in the 20th century, the Crimean Tatars were expelled, and it was an opposite process. You remember about Holodomor here, right? And when you look at the pictures from that times, that shows a lot of wheat and bread. You start asking questions where this bread ended up. The same is with buildings, for example. You look at the buildings where people are living, but you understand that they are not those people who actually constructed those buildings. You can have different attitudes towards colonialism and colonial practices, but the question is how we perceive ourselves and what we need to do next. Because what we experienced, it was a colonialism trap, for Ukrainians. Ukrainians will always propose this role to be an accomplice in colonialization, so join us and be a part of the colony. And Ukrainians have always been like Scots. I mean, there are Scots. They're also a lot more or less, exotic, being independent and all, and they're Irish, and English and Scots are kind of colonizers for them. So this model was imposed on Ukrainians for many years too. And this was a bomb planted a long time ago, because for obvious reason people tend to follow their emotions, and the people were accustomed to the status that they had, and they didn't want to change anything. And those who were reminding them about that, they make them angry, Those people irritate them. Now there is a live discussion about About names, about toponymy. As now a lot is being said about the need to restore the names they used in the past. But when you start asking people about that, what names need to be introduced, and the idea is, you go to people and say, okay, we need to rename this avenue. What name do you want? But that is regarded as an attempt to do something with the motherland, really. And people naturally ask the question, why would we change that? And the question is how we can get out of this trap when people offer Ukrainians to stay within the paradigm. And the problem is that there has been this tradition for forever, this image that there is an enemy. The Dragomanov, the famous historian, about when he was writing about the Turks, Turkey, he said that Ukrainians need to be thankful to the Russian Empire for freeing them from this threat from the south, this historic enemy, and this concept that's been repeated and repeated over and over again, and then it is displayed in the artworks. So it's important, to talk about that, to speak out about it, maybe even to irritate people, because without that, then we won't have any reaction.
A question to you, whether this is a sign of the colonial perception of the world. Yes, you are quite right. It is easy to put responsibility on somebody than to accept that you are a part of the same colonial attitude. I hope that we will time to have one more round of discussion. I would like to give the floor to Ms. Denis Yashne, who is a representative of the expert Crimean Platform Expert Network. But before that, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Maria Kulikovska, Ukrainian multimedia hybrid artist of Crimean origin, and she created several projects on the eve of the first Crimean Platform Summit. And she would like to share her own experience of life in Crimea. Hello, I'm Maria. I'm Maria Kolakivska. I'm an artist from Kerch. I was born in Kerch. I'm an artist, an architect and actionist. I would like to tell you a very personal story, a story from my childhood. which for me says much about identity, self-identity, and understanding who you are. When I was very, very young, the perestroika in the Soviet Union had just started. The Soviet Union collapsed, and for my family, this coincided with the return of Crimean Tatars back to Crimea. At the time, my parents had a small land plot in Kateles, and my parents started to build up a house, and at that time a family of Crimean Tatars arrived to the neighborhood, and they started also to build up the new house. This was a family with 4 children. They had no resources at all, and my parents invited them to live with us, to stay with us in our house. Thus, I grew up in close contact with the Crimean Tatar culture. I even learned a bit the Crimean Tatar language at that time. For the first time, I tasted Crimean Tatar cuisine and adored it. Crimean Tatar girls had become like siblings to me, and they spoke their own language and started to learn a bit of Russian, a bit of Ukrainian. And we both grew up in understanding that we were Ukrainians, that we lived in Ukraine. Each day in the kindergarten, I heard that we were Ukrainians, and at that time we learned that it was Russian propaganda which tried to convince us that we were Russians. And in that rather complicated environment, I found myself staying in the surrounding of exclusively Crimean Tatar children. We spent a lot of time together. I had actually 2 Easters in a year. One was Ramadan holidays, and another one was Ukrainian Easter, Ukrainian Orthodox Easter. For me, it became quite natural being a Ukrainian and perceive that children as Ukrainians, but at the same time Crimean Tatars. At that time, being rather small, I did not distinguish between these 2 groups of people. Although my parents also were from the old family of migrants to Crimea, and they tried to give me this lesson that we also were migrants. With this, I am pleased to give the floor to Denis Yashne, leading researcher of the Kyiv-Pечерsk Lavra National Preserve and a representative of the Crimean Platform Expert Network. Could you please speak more about the attitude towards Crimean Tatars, which is multiplicated in these pictures of 19th and 20th centuries? My special research interests were devoted to the depiction of Crimean Tatars in the times of Russian Empire and under Soviet Union. The Russian Empire, the border between 19th and 20th centuries, produced a lot of visual aids, and I'm speaking not about pictures which were expensive, but about postcards which were kind of available and accessible for broad layers of population. Today we mentioned about simplification and glossiness of the Crimean subjects. Actually, these were the first manipulations. Crimean Tatars on that postcards were called either simply Tatars or simply the Crimean types or Crimean typical people. And we can clearly see the two types of depictions in Crimea. These were either beautiful landscapes of Yalta, Sevastopol, Simferopol, etc., beautiful pictures, or the very neglected landscapes of Crimea, of very poor villages, so to say, romantic ruins. This is a clear substitution of the content, deep content and deep meaning of culture itself with the empty shelling, the empty visual images. When, and thus you may find out Ukrainians in their national costumes at the postcards of early 20th century, Crimean Tatars or simply Tatars in their national costumes at the postcards national at the beginning of 20th century, and looking at the postcards of that period, you may find all sorts of houses of Crimean Tatars. When we look at the postcards of early 20th century, you see this very typical views and landscapes which you expect actually to see there, either glamorous cities and landscapes, glamorous landscapes, or very poor villages. And you should ask yourself a question: who were the authors who produced all that colonial vision? Now I would like to open our Q&A session. You may offer your questions and maybe comments. I would like to ask a question. Good afternoon. I'm Alexandra Galenka. I'm a historian. First of all, I would like to say from the very beginning that I slightly disagree with Jamala. While Chebureks may sound offensive to as a representation of Crimean culture, for me Chebureks had become the starting point for my interest in the Crimean Tatar culture. I had immediately when I tasted it, I asked myself a question: why why this culture might be interesting to us, and how we Ukrainians should build up our relations with this culture. And when we speak about parallels, why, as a Ukrainian, I should object against Ukrainian borscht. So why to object against the Crimean Tatar chaburek? I think this is a cultural heritage, a part of cultural heritage of Crimean Tatar peoples, and perhaps there's a part of Crimean Tatar heritage will live longer than even Jamala herself. And now a bit of comments about what I have heard today about this new, very definite notion, agent involvement or agent representation of the colonial culture. And about decolonization. I would like to start from decolonization. Decolonization has two aspects. The first one is to overcome the heritage of the colonizers and to overcome the vision of the colonizers upon the decolonized, and to overcome the feelings of yourself as a colonized nation. And the attitude of the colonizers could be described in one word. The attitude of colonizers is represented by the of the colonized people is represented by the by colonizers as an irresponsibility. That is, the colonized nation is unable to become responsible for the destiny of their own nation, their country, and they try to put on this responsibility on the colonizers. And that is first step to decolonize yourself, is to accept this responsibility. Quite often we listen to the slogan, Crimea is Ukraine. Who could formulate this? Just in one sentence, why Crimea is Ukraine? I can formulate it in two words: the onshore corridor, the onshore connection. I can say it in one word as Ukrainian historian, because Ukrainian people created Ukraine by means of colonizing the Crimea. That is simply saying that Crimea is Ukraine because Ukrainians colonized Crimea. In 1193, Ukrainian regiments of Prince Iziaslav met Polovtsi army 30 kilometers from the Crimean Peninsula. Bogdan Khmelnytsky and his troops in his capital in Chigirin. 400 years after Prince Iziaslav, just in 300 kilometers from the Crimean Peninsula. And actually, this reflects Ukrainian colonization of Crimea, and the arts reflects this process. These were not the Russians who opened the step. These were Ukrainians who discovered the Crimean steppes. When we speak about objects of art which has no direct messages, but we see the bright colors, the mixture of colors and multitude of colors, which later on transforms into the multiple colors of Ukrainian arts. You won't find this festival of colors in Shishkin's landscapes, but you could find them in Ukrainian arts. Now, the way out from the crisis. As a historian, I am ready to bear responsibility for my words. I can read Tatar and Turkish texts because to produce a responsible opinion, you should read the texts from both sides. Ukrainians were never the imperial colonizers. The Ukrainian colonization happened in a non-imperial way. They are not making an attempt to impose Ukrainian culture upon local population, Turkish population of Crimea. They tried to understand the local culture instead and to penetrate into it and thus exchanged and brought Ukrainian culture into Crimean one. And Ukrainians have studied the Crimean history. I would refer to your podcast, tobacco and the watermelon, which in Ukrainian are both Turkish words. And this reflects that Ukrainians had borrowed hundreds of Turkish words. This reflects the process of this cultural exchange and cultural studies. Thank you very much for your comment, and we would like to give the floor to the speakers and respond to your remark. I have quoted Jamala about Cheburek. I do not mean that we put Jamala versus Cheburek, but I think that Jamala wanted to say that Crimean culture is not only about Chebureks, but about much deeper things. I did not want to comment on history during my intervention, but Alexander had added much from the historian's point of view. My comment to Cheburek and that Cheburek is a distorted, that Soviet Belash is a distorted version of Cheburek. Actually, this reflects the common process of Soviet colonization of both Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. I won't try to dispute with Alexander. I believe that we should look into the past of both nations and find the images which bring us closer to each other. And we have to build up our relations based upon contemporary world. That is, looking onto the past exclusively is destructive. We should look into the future and onto today's realities. As for the responsibility, a video by Maria Kolakowska resonated in me. In Kerch, I knew a person in 1980s who was trying to rediscover Crimean Tatar wells, who was fundraising for this big project and trying to restore them. And at that time, among Crimean Tatars who were coming back in late 1980s, early 1990s, they did not respond to that project, and I think this happened due to the terrible situation of that people, which we heard from Maria. They were in difficult life circumstances. They were coming to the empty place, and they had to build up their lives from scratch. In my discussions with Crimean residents, I heard quite often that the beginning of the years 2000, it was the beginning of national development, for ethnical development for Crimean Tatar community in Crimea, and that development of the local community was disrupted in 2014.
Дякую дуже. Про чебуреки.
Again about chebureks.
Взагалі, одна зі сторін колонізації цих процесів це
One
спрощення.
of the aspects of colonization is simplifications of any culture. And chebureks, these are simplification of the Crimean Tatar culture. Crimean Tatars would like to be associated not only with chebureks, but with many other things, because we have rich culture and we have many things to offer to the attention of the world. And when we speak about Crimean landscapes and Crimean seashores, this is only for people who like that. But we have a tragic moments in our history, and now we expect to have a healing period, a period when we would like to heal from the trauma of our psyche. And unless this trauma is transformed, it cannot be cured. So in this attempt to transform the trauma, we face with the resistance, which is quite natural resistance. We understand that this natural resistance saved Crimean Tatars in exile. They managed to survive as a nation. This resistance to the interferences of other peoples. Today we have to overcome this natural resistance. We have to transform this traumatic experience and to develop synergy and to build up a cooperation, which I believe will be productive for both peoples, Ukrainian and Crimean Tatars. And cultural part of this process could become a strong soft power.
дискусії, які
because
можуть
it
бути
can act
гострими
without
наразі, да?
political
І тому
discussions,
я
which
дуже
can
дякую за цей
become
захід, бо це
rather
можливість пізнати один
strong.
одного не тільки
I
через
believe that
політичні шляхи, але й
cultural
через культурні. І мені здається, ми
interaction
всі
is
в
the
один
best
рівень на
way
можливість
to
цей
learn
досвід
each other
трансформувати.
better
Дякую дуже.
without involvement of political aspects. Thank you, Olesa.
Я хотіла зареагувати на слова Матвія. У мене є
I would like to respond to the words of Ms. Hill and disagree with the statement that we do not have cultural oppositions. We have opposite positions in culture, and today we witness when Ukrainian artists reject to perform at the same stages with the Russian artists. And today's society is very much stirred up with the political discussions. There are a lot of painful moments in art and culture today. This is the point of my disagreement with you, but I agree with you that in today's reality, people from different regions, different backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, they have to find out mutual understanding. And now, as to the simplification. Simplification is not always the way to suppress something. My family story. I come from Lviv. My husband is from Kiev. Several years ago, attending ethnography museum in Lviv, my husband and me, my husband have noticed that there were national costumes from Lemkivshchina, Boykivshchina, Hutzolshchina, and Eastern Ukraine. The issue is that Eastern Ukraine comprises many regions like Lemkivshchina, Hutzolshchina, etc.
Так, я також хотіла би додати своє, але більше
I would like
музейного досвіду,
to
тому що і
speak
дослів
from
Олександра,
the
і дослів мене,
museum
тому що, звісно, що діалог це
worker
найперше, що
point of view. I believe that first of all we need dialogue. When I mentioned the need to start research projects about our collection, and this won't be possible without Crimean Tatar researchers.
насправді паралельні процеси, тому що українці
The studies of the collections and decolonization, this should be two parallel processes, as well as there should be a parallel process with the Ukrainian decolonization. These days we work on the new exhibition, the new concept of our exhibition, which will open after the victory. We want to change our approach and remove some inertia which we inherited from the Soviet past. The inertia existed in the 19th century collection where we exhibited Pimanenko and Shevchenko inhabitants, who represent the imperial optic of Ukrainians. The same is true about Crimean, division of Crimean history. And this only shows that the collection of our museum requires further studies. Even this first glance suggests that those who would like to understand new things, that they should be at the proper level of readiness to find out new things.
Експертної мережі Кримської платформи хоче щось сказати. І
Ваше питання візьмемо і потім будемо завершувати.
Ну, по-перше, я хотіла подякувати за таку дискусію. Вона дійсно дуже-дуже потрібна. Ближче. Дуже потрібна, мені здається, взагалі, да, в рамках сьогоднішніх таких дискусій. І декілька рефлексій моїх, і одне питання буде. Ну, перше, я була на виставці «Дивовижна історія Криму». Це була перша така культурна подія після звільнення мого чоловіка Ахтема Чегоза в 17-му році. Ця виставка була, наскільки пам'ятаю, наприкінці 17-го року. Або на початку 18-го, це не важливо, да. Але, ви знаєте, як кримська татарка, дійсно, я абсолютно згодна з тим, що сказав пан Мартін про те, що ми шукаємо щось, що буде давати тобі сили жити далі, да? Бо ти покинув свій дім і відчуваєш себе, ну зараз мені здається, такий травматичний досвід ми всі вже маємо, і ви розумієте, про що я кажу. Я була на той виставці декілька разів. Перший раз на відкритті, потім я прийшла через тиждень, потім ще тиждень. І намагалася для себе знайти в тих дивовижних дійсно історіях Криму про різні культури і народи якийсь такий, знаєте, континуїтет. Бо логічним завершенням всіх цих націй і культур, які проходили через територію Криму, є кримські татари. Бо навіть сьогодні тут, в цій залі, є представники кримських татар, і ми дуже різні. Наші антропогенні наші якості, вони трошки відрізняються, тому що ми мікс всіх цих народів, які були на теренах Криму, які нас сформували. Бо правда, дійсно, ми спочатку довіряли Богу Тенгрі, Богу неба, потім ми були на якомусь етапі, ну не кримські татари, а як спільнота, скажімо так, да? Ми були християнами, потім прийшов іслам, а потім було вже Кримське ханство. Тому мені здається, починати треба саме з цього, з розуміння того, хто ми є. Хто ми, кримські татари, є для українців. Ми є тим, що нас постійно нав'язувала радянська історіографія, тим в 13 столітті, вибачте, пришедшими ордами монголо-татар, чи ми є саме тим міксом культур і народів, які нас сформували як націю. Це перша така рефлексія. Друга рефлексія якраз про колоніалізм. Ви знаєте, мені здається, коли ми кажемо про колоніалізм, деколоніалізм, ми маємо пам'ятати, що це в першу чергу дискусія про центр та периферію. Так ось, в той Україні, яку ми всі хочемо бачити, в той фантастичній Україні, не має бути центра, має бути багато центрів. І мені здається, от саме такий підхід, він і буде формувати от цю фантастичну країну, в якої буде ця політична нація українці з різним походженням, але з єдиною такою парадигмою, да, скажімо так. Третя така моя рефлексія стосовно того, що я почула на одній з конференцій, де наша організація приймала участь, один із очільників бивших колишніх очільників НАТО, який займався питанням захисту об'єктів культурної спадщини під час збройних конфліктів, а це є наша фахова діяльність нашої організації, Кримський інститут стратегічних досліджень. Він сказав про те, що якщо ви хочете деколонізувати історію, вам треба почати з реінтерпретації вашої історії. І починати треба, його думка була така, що починати треба саме з історії Другої світової війни, але мені здається, нам треба починати трошки раніше. І питання якраз те, що зараз було затронуто про переатрибутацію музейних предметів. Мені здається, це надзвичайно цікаво, особисто для мене. Бо я абсолютно згодна з тою тезою, що коли Росія буде покидати Крим, вона буде знищувати і забирати з собою все абсолютно. І якщо ми кажемо про історію, культуру кримських татар, то це взагалі дуже трагічна історія. Бо єдиний пам'ятник, який у нас на сьогоднішній день є, це Бахчисарайський ханський палац. І та, совершенно невеличка музейна колекція, яка формує нас, те, що знаходиться в фондах Бахчисарайського історико-культурного заповідника, і те, що формує нас, як кримських татар, як націю, предмети, які є ілюстрацією нас, як нації, їх дуже-дуже мало. Я за весь цей час мого перебування вне Крима, я побувала в дуже багато різних музеїв, бачила декілька музейних предметів, які атрибутовані, на мій погляд, не зовсім коректно. Бо ми все пам'ятаємо, що певний період історії, взагалі все, що було пов'язано з Кримом, було заборонено. Да? Чи можливо зараз, і чи готова зараз, на вашу думку, як експертів, Україна, українські інституції, українська держава почати процес саме переатрибутації тих предметів, які знаходяться в музейних фондах і пов'язані з історією Крима, які зараз атрибутовані, наприклад, як османські предмети, або персидського походження, або щось таке. От таке питання. Вибачте, що так довго, але...
Дякую.
Так.
Доброго дня. Ганка Третяк, я арт-куратор і партнер Національного художнього музею. Хочу розказати трошки, буквально одну рефлексію, пов'язану з проектами в Криму, тому що з 2006 до 2013 року практично всі фестивалі артові, які були в Криму, я була одним з співзасновників, або арт-фестивалі, які проходили під час великих фестивалів музичних. Це «Джаз Коктебель», «Артішок» арт-фестиваль, це фестиваль «Казантіп», під час якого був дуже великий фестиваль артовий, який робила повністю українська команда. І ми на меті ставили саме українську повістку дня, артову, художню, в Криму. Це ініціатива, я повністю погоджуюсь з Олесею про те, що це скоріше ініціатива громадянського суспільства українського, ніж якісь інші прояви. Але хочу сказати про такі польові дослідження. Найпростіша і найкраща співпраця української команди була саме з кримськими татарами. Треба сказати, що ми і кримські татари відчували завжди себе в Криму під час проведення таких артових великих форумів. Це були міжнародні проекти, в деяких там приймало участь від 56 митців топових на той момент з різних країн світу. Не лише Україна, але вся Європа. І з чим ми зіштовхнулися, особливо коли під час майстер-класів, пов'язаних з архітектурою, з ландшафтним дизайном, ленд-артом, з тим, що, на жаль, оця, скажімо так, російська окупація Криму, вона продовжувалася до 2013 року. І в моменти, коли треба було навіть робити якісь проекти, ми це не могли робити через те, що практично вся лінія, я кажу про проекти, які були там в Коктебелі, які були на узбережжі моря, вся нерухомість, всі простори, які можна було використовувати, вони належали комусь, хто був не в Україні, з ким ми не могли говорити, з ким ми не могли обговорювати, яким чином відбувається далі співпраця. І єдині проєкти, які ми робили, це був Центральний Крим, це там, де Бахчисарай, і там, де кримські татари були, і це найпростіша співпраця, і взагалі немає ніяких проблем в комунікації, і абсолютно зрозуміло культурне середовище, яким чином з цим співпрацювати. І це більше 10 років моєї співпраці по всі літні місяці. Справа в тому, що відчуття того, що ми теж там не були всі ці роки частиною цього простору, Україну я маю на увазі, вона була абсолютно під час всіх цих років глибинного занурення по кожній території, по кожному проєкті. І проєкти, які ми по ітогу робили і до чого вони призводили, це були такі покрокові шляхи для того, щоб на цій території розкривати те, що було історично. Починаючи від 2013 році там святкування 100-річчя будинку Волошина і переосмислення того, що відбувалося тут на цій території всі ці роки, треба сказати, що треба враховувати ситуацію, яка є зараз, а яка буде після того, коли Крим повернеться в Україну.
Дякую вам дуже за коментар.
Дякую.
Тоді коротка відповідь, рефлексія тих спікерів, які хочуть висловитися, і будемо закривати захід. Ми вже трохи затримали, але дякую всім за інтерес і за те, що ви тут.
Мабуть, щодо музеїв я мушу відповісти перше. Так, звичайно, я впевнена, що музейні співробітники будуть готові до такої співпраці. Тут є мої колеги з Національного музею народного декоративного мистецтва України. Я думаю, що вони або підтримують, або прокоментують мої слова. Жаль, пішов наш колега з Києво-Печерського заповідника. Але, я думаю, що тут повна відкритість, звичайно, до переатрибуції, звісно. Робота над дослідженням музейних колекцій ніколи не припиняється. Що стосується художнього музею, зокрема там нашого досвіду, то, звісно, ми знаємо про таку проблему, що багато хто з художників кримсько-татарських можуть вказуватись, як, наприклад, узбекські художники, або там мати якусь іншу ідентифікацію. Звісно, що це також процес, це також робота, до якої ми готові. Взагалі, я хотіла би сказати, що про це говорили інші спікери, і я їм страшенно вдячна за це, про те, що у нас, ми дуже добре розуміємо досвід кримських татар, їхню долю, тому що тут говорили про Голодомор, про інші геноциди, що ми всі там переживали це. І знаємо, що це таке по собі. Я хотіла би сказати, що ми маємо також такий досвід, що навіть відсутність чогось, вона також може бути мистецькою проблемою, або мистецтвознавчою, або будь-якою дослідницькою проблемою. Тому що в українському мистецтві так само дуже багато пустот, дуже багато інтервалів, дуже багато якихось втрачених сторінок. Тобто над цим всім працює і сучасне мистецтво, тут я не можу не погодитись з Олесею, і, звичайно, дослідники. До речі, маленька репліка ще також щодо вражень, от якраз щодо відсутності, щодо музейних колекцій. Мої молодші колеги з нашого музею, вони поїхали на ознайомчу поїздку, таку міжмузейну, до Дніпра і потрапили в Дніпровський музей, історичний музей імені Яворницького. І коли вони повернулись, вони сказали, що їх страшенно вразила експозиція, тому що там є античність, скіфський період, далі порожнеча і козацтво. Тобто І для них це була уже проблема, да? Тобто, і це проблема, з якою справді треба працювати. Так, дякую.
Я згодна з Оксаною, але хочу додати трошечки тверезого реалізму, тобто ложку дьогтю. Мені здається, що є велика проблема з нашими взагалі музеями в дослідницькій спроможності. Будьмо дуже такі відверті. Наші культурні інституції державні є поганими роботодавцями. Страшенно важко залучати таланти, страшенно важко цим людям створювати такі умови, щоб вони могли працювати, а саме ці люди потрібні для переатрибуції. Тому я думаю, що намір буде і готовність, а з реальною роботою буде дуже складно.
Пані Людмила, якраз директор.
Я хвилиночку, добрий день всім. З приводу музейних колекцій кримсько-татарських матеріалів в наших музеях, це дійсно правда, що їх дуже мало. В нашому музеї зберігаються дуже чудові кримсько-татарські вишивки. Декілька з них зараз в музеї коштовностей виставлені на виставці кримсько-татарській, які чудом вони збереглися і далі вони будуть. От ми сьогодні сиділи з головним зберігачем, і я кажу, після війни треба відбудовувати експозицію, і треба, мабуть, уже виставляти кримсько-татарські вишивки в тому числі, і треба десь знайти автентичний кримсько-татарський костюм. Це теж було б дуже доречно, тому що музей декоративного мистецтва, але він був українського народного декоративного мистецтва, а не декоративного мистецтва України, тому є прогалини і в формуванні колекцій. Ви знаєте, але є речі в історичному музеї, в музеї коштовностей. Багато речей, коли створювався музей коштовностей, вони передавалися з кримських музеїв. Тоді була постанова, наказ Міністерства культури, і вони вже звідти передавалися, і кримсько-татарські були, не тільки археологія, і ще і кримсько-татарські. Що стосується атрибуції, ви знаєте, музеї, я не згодна з тим, що треба, це проблема залучати фахівців. Я знаю, що наш музей, історичний музей, ми тісно працюємо з кримсько-татарськими колегами, розумієте, які приїжджають на конференції і які допомагали атрибутувати саме кримсько-татарські речі. І особливо те, що стосується і вишивок, і те, що стосується ювелірних виробів. Так що я не думаю, що в цьому є проблема, просто є проблема у відсутності, тобто в недостатності цих матеріалів. Але археологічні матеріали татарські, от сказали про Дніпро, а коли була Дніпрогесівська експедиція, то під час цієї експедиції були розкопані, декілька було поховань в урочищі Кринича Балка, якраз 13-14 століття татарські поховання. Дуже цікаві речі. Частково з цих поховань зберігається в історичному музеї, можливо, частково щось є чи в Запоріжжі, чи в Дніпропетровську, але архівні матеріали в Інституті археології. Так що, можна копати і тут, на материковій Україні, і щось все-таки назбирати, знайти і представити. І чудова виставка була все-таки історії Криму в мистецькому арсеналі, яка, ми теж там брали участь, і приємно це згадати. І ви знаєте, те, що треба зараз, це все популяризувати і доводити, і показувати, тому що, це дуже велика культура. Я займалася просто археологією Золотої Орди, звідки теж витоки ці всі, які в кримсько-татарському мистецтві, і в Криму, в Салхаті, центр Золотої Орди Салхат і Старий Крим, де розкопки багато років чомусь вів Ермітаж, а не Україна і не Крим. Але сподіваюся, що ці матеріали залишилися в Криму. Так що з давніх часів багато матеріалів в в Криму і в Україні в тому числі. Просто треба їх підняти і популяризувати. Дякую.
Дякую.
Дякую всім спікерам сьогоднішнього заходу. Дякую гостям, які і слухали, і брали участь. Дякуємо організаторам цьому чудовому музеєві, представництву президента, організації «Кримсос». І сподіваюся, що за рік-два ми вже побачимо тут взагалі супернові картини, які відображають вільний Крим і які відображають його не глянцевим, а справжнім. Дякуємо.
Так, дякуємо всім, так само спікерам, передусім, які озвучували багато дуже цікавих, свіжих, сміливих думок. І також, між іншим, запрошую всіх на виставку, яка триває в скарбниці Національного музею історії України, яка присвячена кримсько-татарській культурі. Це фантастична виставка, і дякую і організаторам, і всім дякую. І також на сторінці представництва президента України в Автономній Республіці Крим є перелік музейних інституцій, 14, в яких зараз тривають ці короткочасні такі проекти, які присвячені 18 травню і Дню вшанування пам'яті жертв геноциду кримськотатарського народу. Всім спасибі ще раз.